37. Yang appeared in the room just as Lady Shi shifted the Jian out of firing mode. "Keep working on her," she said without preamble, turning her back to him and studying the map on the wall. Her hands clasped demurely in front of her, as if she hadn't just threatened to pluck out the eyes of an innocent man and then murder him in cold blood. She waved a hand toward Aranya, who clutched her bound hands to her chest and tried to shove away the stone that had landed in her gut. "Be swift." But Yang didn't immediately look at Aranya. Instead, his eyes trailed from his mother to the crumpled, blood-stained napkin on the table. He swallowed visibly. "Mother, are you the shapeshifter boy?" Was that a sigh that just escaped Yang? Did his shoulders drop the barest smidge? She wasn't sure, because when he turned his attention to her, his face was like flint. Her heart seized within her. Where was Kai? Yang grabbed her by the forearm and tugged her to her feet, despite her yanking against him. "Take these off now," she growled, thrusting her wrists in his face. "You can't keep delaying us as wielders of the Empire." He merely raised an eyebrow, bent, and heaved her over his shoulder. She grunted and kicked until something sharp pressed against the back of her leg. "Keep wiggling," said Yang, "and I'll slice through the tendons in your knee, and you'll never walk again." Aranya stilled. "Very good," he chuckled. Then they were out of the room, heading somewhere that she didn't know, and with each step she became more worried about what "keep working on her" meant. "What do you know about Lord Xuanwan?" she asked, pressing her bound hands against his back so she could lift her head. "He was here, wasn't he?" "Your curiosity will get you in trouble, Swan Aranya," said Yang. He didn't even try to soften his step when he went down a flight of stairs, and each movement sent his shoulder stabbing into her hip bone. If Kong Lei had been trying to desert Jianninghai, if Xuanwan had been too, and they'd stopped here, did that mean Yang and Lady Shi were planning a revolt? Had they allied themselves with the barbarians in the north? Were they trying to make Kai join them? That had to be it, and Kai wouldn't betray his empire, so he ran from his family. Footsteps sounded ahead of them. Aranya craned to look, but something sharp tapped her knee again. With a surge of fury, she stiffened and stilled. "Clear out," said Yang in a sharp, authoritative voice. Not to her. "It's night," replied an irritated, raspy, smoke-filled voice. A fire wielder. Aranya would bet her life on it. "Yes, well, you stayed too long in Shanette, now didn't you? Out, now. I don't like royalty in my dungeon for long. Besides, Feng will be anxious for her." Royalty? The princess was kidnapped. And also, Shanette, a fire wielder. Was this the fire wielder that had destroyed the body of the warden they'd found? Aranya's mind spun. It felt like she had the pieces of the puzzle. But how did they fit together? When Yang turned a corner and several figures passed him, she used her core to lift herself just enough to catch a glimpse of them. 3 people, wearing heavy, obscuring cloaks. Yet somehow they were familiar. Then one of them glanced back at her, and Aranya's eyes widened to behold a face she knew. It was a man's face, handsome with a sad sort of hopelessness shining in his eyes. They hardened when they met hers, and in a flurry of cloak he'd turned his back on her. He was the illusionist she and Kai had battled in the rain outside the inn on their way to Suguan. Just when Yang started down a flight of stairs, Aranya caught sight of a 4th cloaked and hooded figure. She wore no royal garments, only a simple set of travel-soiled robes. But there was no mistaking the grace with which she moved, the subtle elegance. Aranya was not a girl of refined taste by any means, but even she could tell the difference. The girl's hands were bound, and she was yanked after what Aranya guessed was the fire wielder. She stumbled, fell to her knees, unable to brace her fall. But she didn't make a sound, not even when she was roughly yanked to her feet after her captors. The cursed princess. The one born without magic. Then Aranya's view was cut off, swallowed up in dimness as Yang descended further down the stairs. Her breathing came faster with each step, but her mind was spinning too fast for her to have time to panic. What could Yang and Lady Shi want with a cursed princess? Or was it someone else? This Fang that Yang had mentioned. Suddenly, a memory clicked into place. What had she heard in that Secret Services meeting back at the Capitol? That they needed to find out what was happening to these wielders because of the barbarian unrest in the north, because of someone named Fang Zedong amassing troops. The name meant nothing to her, but it still tasted wrong on her tongue. Another flash of that map in that room with the red hanging lanterns, of a path going north, straight to Butagan, converging here, in Gabe. Here, at the Shi mansion. Keys jangled, then echoed. A dank coolness washed over her, sending her spine tingling and her chest tightening. Then, abruptly, something hit her. "Where's Kai?" she asked, unable to hide the thread of panic in her voice. No answer. He'd been fighting Yang last she'd seen him, but that fight was clearly over. Did that mean Kai had lost? He wasn't dead, right? Yang was trying to get him to comply, not to kill him. Right? Her guts sank as her brain scrambled for possible explanations. Had he left? Left them? Had he made his escape without them? No, he wouldn't. Kai wouldn't abandon them. Wouldn't abandon her. After all, he'd come back for her earlier in the bathing chamber. "Where's Talon?" she asked. Yang snorted and readjusted his grip on her. "He's being dismembered because you wouldn't talk. Would you like to go watch?" The seed of panic blossomed into a frantic surge that swept through her body. She bucked, slamming her knees into his ribs as hard as she could, but she was off balance, rendering the blow impotent. Yang only grunted and tightened his hold. She shifted her hands back into Talons and tried to stab them straight into his back as she squirmed. But she couldn't hurt him, because just then he flung her to the ground. She landed painfully on her tailbone and only managed to roll slightly to the side to keep from injuring herself. Yang stood before her, his form almost entirely in the shadows cast by a lone lantern. It hung on the wall of what appeared to be a dark, dank cell. Aranya scooted into a better sitting position, scowling up at him. "You're bluffing," said Aranya. "You're bluffing to get me to talk." "You're gambling a lot on this being a bluff. Talon is too skilled for you. Unfortunately, skill doesn't matter when you're outnumbered 20-1. The blood drained from her face, dread dousing the fight that had previously flooded every inch of muscle and bone in her body. Yang crouched before her, studying her face. He reached out with one hand as though to take her chin, but she knocked his hand away and snarled. "All I need from you, Swan Aranya," he said, unfazed, "is the name of the city where Kai accepted his appointment. If you tell me now, I'll say the word and my guards will stop the feral wielder's torture." Aranya squeezed her eyes shut and drew a deep breath between clenched teeth. "I told you, I'm not talking." "So you and Kai are that involved then, That you would give the life of your comrade for Kai to shirk his responsibilities?" "Why do you want to know the city so much?" she snapped, refusing to answer his stupid question. "Why do you want Kai? He's just fulfilling his duty to the Empire." "Does duty to Empire outweigh duty to family?" Yang spat. "You have family, don't you, Aranya? Would you abandon them?" Would you abandon them? Aranya jerked back involuntarily, hitting her head on the cold stone wall. What? Yang's eyes glittered. You do, don't you? Have family that you're responsible for. Don't you want to go back to them? Take care of them? You saw how our mother is suffering. She just wants Kai to visit her in her final days. You, of all people, should understand. He was manipulating her, yet knowing it couldn't quell the rising burst of fury, frustration, and utter helplessness in her chest. She turned her face away from him, fixing unfocused eyes on the shadows playing across crevices of the wall and the dark grout between each stone. I'm not a fool, she said, her voice low. I know this isn't just about visiting during the festivals. There's more at play here, and it has to do with Fong Zedong, doesn't it? 1 minute she was speaking. The next, pain exploded across her face. Her neck snapped backward from the shock of it. For a split second, she was too stunned to realize he'd just backhanded her. Then he was dragging her close, his nails digging into her upper arm. The things I could grant you? Money, appointments, status, opportunity, connections. I can give you so much. Things Kai can't dream of giving you while he runs from the she name. You have family. Do you want them cared for? Medical bills paid, comfortable housing. Do you want servants to take care of them while you are running around on your little missions? All you have to do, Aranya, is say the word. The name of the city, and then say what you want. I'll give it to you, whatever you ask. He was shockingly earnest. To her utter horror, Aranya believed every word that he said. Not just that he could give her those things, but that he would. If she betrayed Kai. No matter how her eyes searched his for the slightest glint of malice or trickery, she found none. But she did glimpse that veiled desperation she'd seen when he'd noticed his mother's bloody handkerchief. He could give her the money, the help, the security, the everything she needed to take care of Ye. All this desperate flailing she had been doing for the last 7 years to take care of Ye. Could it be over in a second? With one word, could she have everything she'd been trying to gain? Anything you want, Aranya, he whispered. He must have read her hesitance in her face. Just say the word. Aranya met his gaze. Lantern light flickered across his dark, dilated irises. And in their reflection, she saw herself. Someone who felt too small for the weight she bore. She and Yang understood each other in a way that she and Kai would never understand each other. And he could give her what Kai could never give her. Tears welled up in her eyes. She hated them, hated herself for them. Slowly, she drew a deep, shuddering breath. And then she opened her mouth. No. Yang blinked once, twice, then again. His brow twisted, his lips parting in shock. He thought she was going to give in. He'd apparently been sure of it. Aranya lunged forward and, with a snarl, grabbed his collar with her bound hands. There are many things that I want, Evanescer, but I'll get them myself. The right way. I won't sell my loyalty. The easy thing to do, and possibly the wise thing, would have been to give him what he wanted and take what she could. To do whatever it took to take care of her grandfather. But Ye would have wanted her to stand her ground, and she never wanted to be too ashamed to look him in the eye. But more practical than that, she was only valuable to the Shi family so long as she held this information. If she gave it up now, there was the chance they'd have her killed and be done. She couldn't risk it yet, no matter how much she was inclined to believe Yang's promises. She wasn't fully sure if she'd just doomed herself and her comrades, and possibly even Ye himself, and she didn't know how she would pay for this decision, but she couldn't deny the thrill of taking a stand, of refusing to bend or back down. The thrill was short-lived. Yang had her by the arms again, dragging her up so he could seethe in her face. "Fine. Your loyalty stands up against gifts. We'll see how it stands against pain." With that, he flung her against the stone wall and strode out of the cell. He snapped his fingers as Aranya caught her balance, panting. She dug her talons into stone, gritting her teeth against her spinning head. A cloaked figure filled the doorway. Yang slammed the door shut with a clang that rung in her ears like the drawing of a blade in the stillness of an empty cave. Aranya's gut plunged all the way to her toes. Nevertheless, she dragged herself to her feet, her heart pounding faster and faster. Was she going to be tortured? Oh, Father, she couldn't last against torture. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes and reconsidered. Maybe she should just give the name of that city up. Just betray everything and be done. You're only valuable to them with this information. She sighed, and a dry sob worked its way through her chest. There was no other option. No option but to endure if there was to be any hope of escape. She steeled her shoulders and faced the figure slowly approaching her. Her eyes flickered beyond him to Yang, standing outside her cell with an expression of iron. Utterly gone was that slip of vulnerability she'd seen in him. She glanced back just in time to watch the figure throw back his hood. Apparently, she was expecting a face of scars or something else fierce and unyielding. Instead, it was the unremarkable, bearded face of a man. If her feet weren't bound, she would have taken an uneasy step backward. As it was, she could only stand, bracing herself against the wall. Then, the worst thing happened. He didn't pull out some torture device meant to wrench screams from her until her throat was raw, her vocal cords shredded. Instead, the man's face shifted. His whole body shifted as he bent forward. His arms became front legs, his nose lengthening into a long gray snout. The cloak melted away into silver fur that caught the erratic dancing light of the lantern. Teeth lengthened, lips pulled back into a feral snarl. Worst of all, his dark eyes shifted until they were nothing but black marbles, void of all human reason and compassion. A wild, bloodthirsty wolf stood before her, growling as he prowled closer, teeth flashing like daggers of fire. "Dragons blast it!" Aranya moaned. Yang had set a full shapeshifter on her, one that would shred her to pieces until she talked. 38.
Kai's lungs heaved alongside Talons as they tore through the gates of the mansion on horseback. Arrows whizzed toward them as guards chased after them. He pulled Aranya's horse behind him, forcing it into a gallop. "Ride in front of me!" Kai yelled to Talon. "They won't shoot me! And here, catch this!" Kai threw the lead to Talon, who snatched it out of the air as he tossed Kai an incredulous look, before urging his horse faster, taking the lead through the streets of Gabay. People scattered, screamed, loose chickens squawked, and shot into the air in a flurry of feathers. "Left!" shouted Kai. If Talon hadn't heard him, they were heading straight for the central market, and it would be impossible not to hurt anyone. Talon veered to the left down an alley, Aranya's horse nickering and flattening its ears as it slowed to follow. As they fled through the city and out into the wilderness, Kai's mind tripped over itself. He was so distracted, he almost forgot to give Talon directions. Aranya was back there, and even if he had a plan to rescue her, and even if he knew his family wouldn't kill her if they thought she would be a tool to manipulate Kai, he couldn't help his frantic pulse. What if they did hurt her? Or what if things had changed, and they simply killed her outright? What if getting Talon out would cost Aranya everything? What if Aranya talked? What if she told them he'd accepted an appointment in Sushui? That's what they would want to know after all, so that they could find his specific appointment and maneuver a way to get him dismissed so he had nowhere to go. "You should come home," his mother and brother would say, "where you belong." And why shouldn't Aranya reveal that information, if it meant keeping her eyes? What loyalty did she have toward him? He'd messed up her appointment. Fathers, he'd held her at knife point last night. They were well out of the city by now, entering the familiar forest wilderness. Talon drew up short. "I am going to murder you, boy," he said, whirling in his saddle while their mounts foamed at the mouth and heaved for air. "Aranya!" Kai was already swinging down from his saddle. "I can save her. There are these secret passageways built by my father. I'll find her, get her out through one of those tunnels, and meet you back here. If there are tunnels out of there, then you can be sure they've blocked them so you can't escape that way," snapped Talon. Kai shook his head vigorously, still panting. It was taking everything not to evanesce away. Every moment he delayed was another chance for something to go wrong, for Aranya to get hurt. "No, my mother and brother don't know about those tunnels. Just me." "You expect me to believe that? How could you be the only one who knows?" "Because my father only trusted me." It was the most honest answer he could give, without delving into too much detail. My father had plans for me. "You can't operate on the assumption that you're the only one who knows about the tunnels, or you could walk right into an ambush. And it's Aranya who will be the one to suffer. You can only use them if you first verify that they're empty. Move fast." Kai nodded, relief that Talon wasn't challenging him anymore, running like water through his limbs. Quickly, they coordinated a meeting spot, and Talon said he'd get the horses there and stay there for only 10 minutes. "If you're not back, I'm leaving the horses to come help you. And if anything happens to her, I will have your head. Understand?" Kai would cut off his own head if his family did anything to her. And though only a moment before they were experienced wielder berating new graduate, for the span of their locked gazes, they were comrades, of the same mind and same goal. Get Aranya out of there. Then Kai turned and vanished into the air.
The wolf pounced. Aranya threw herself to the left, toward the bars of the cell. The wolf snapped its jaws, pouncing again. She rolled, gasped, grabbed hold of the bars. Frantically, she pulled herself upright and flung her talons in front of her, barely in time to slash away the wolf's maw as it came for her face. There was no time for screaming, for hardly any sound, barely a scrap of any emotion save utter panic and desperate instinct. The wolf snarled, jumped, and landed with sharp-tipped paws on her shoulders, knocking her straight to the ground. Aranya gasped as her back hit the floor of the cell hard. She rolled so its teeth barely missed her shoulders, then immediately flung herself into a roll in the opposite direction. Full shapeshifters always win, she thought, frantic tears pricking at her eyes. Stupid, stupid partial magic. Never in her life had she hated her magic as much as she did now. If she was a full shapeshifter, she could get out of these wretched bonds. If she was a full shapeshifter, she wouldn't be so disadvantaged. She could tear claw and fang into her opponent, letting wild animal instinct take over her body and mind. She was only delaying the inevitable, only putting off her fate until she was too exhausted to keep fighting. The wolf caught her between its paws. She looked up into those black, soulless eyes, the snarling mouth and incisors gleaming in the lantern light just inches from her face. Using her bound wrists, she stabbed upward with her talons, aiming for its neck. She only succeeded in knocking aside its bite. It snapped again at her neck, and she let out a cry as she barely knocked it aside again. "Say the name of the city, and I'll call him off," said Yong's voice from somewhere. She needed to get out from beneath it. If she was to have any hope, she'd need to go on the offense. With a vicious swipe, she clawed with her talons at the wolf's face, while bringing up her knees sharply to land a kick to the wolf's lower abdomen. It snarled in her face. Another cry, this one of fear, sliced through her body and ripped free of her gritted teeth. Those powerful jaws came snapping for her again, utterly relentless and impossible to fend off for long. It was so fast she barely had time to react, barely had time to get her talons up to spare her face. The wolf's teeth clamped down on her bound wrists. Teeth punctured her skin. Blood flowed down her arms. The magic bonds wrenched tighter. Aranya screamed. "Have to get out! Have to get out!" Using all of her strength, as the wolf bit harder, she flung her arms to one side and kicked her knees at the same time, barely rolling the wolf off her. It let go of her wrists, immediately coming for her face again. Aranya scooted so her back was to the bars and kicked her legs out hard, knocking away the wolf for a split second. How could she beat it? That was the only way she wasn't going to be mauled to shreds here. She had to overcome it. In order to do that, she had to get ahead of it. How could she get ahead of something that was so much stronger, fiercer, and wilder than her? Its bloodthirsty instincts were uncontrollable, its desire for her blood insatiable. How could she overcome it if she knew how strong those instincts were and had a hard enough time controlling them just as a partial shapeshifter? How could she ever... Wait. Its instincts. How many times had Qigong and Kai told her to put her claws away because they were messing with her ability to think straight? What if she used the wolf's instinct against it? Even though wielding her talons brought out the animalistic instinct inside her, she was still mostly human. Could she use her partial magic to outsmart it? As the wolf came charging for her again, she reached up, grabbed the throat of the wolf with her bound hands, and brought up her knees again to drive it forward and slammed its head into the cell bars above her. Blunt-tipped nails dug into her shoulder, making her cry out. She rolled to the right, getting out from underneath it. Frantically, as it leapt for her again, she caught hold of the bars and dragged herself to her feet. Gripping the iron in both hands, her wrists aching and bleeding, she jumped and swung her feet to connect straight with the wolf's jaw. It was the heartbeat she needed to hobble and swing herself into the corner, standing with her back pressed into the cold bars and stone wall. She held her bound hands out in front of her defensively, slightly crouching. She panted, meeting the black-eyed glare of the wild animal cornering her and snarling. Foam dripped from its jaws onto the floor. It approached slowly, torchlight gleaming on its silver hide and casting a long, terrifying shadow against the opposite wall of the cell. She saw the look in its eyes. It wanted to kill her, despite the orders she was nearly certain it had been given, which was to keep her alive. She would use that desire against it. She cowered in that corner, letting it savor its victory over her as it prowled closer. Oh, please let this work. Please let this work. She was quickly draining her strength, gasping and barely staying upright even now. If this didn't work, there would be no hope left for her. Her muscles quivered, her eyes too wide, and her lungs expanding and shrinking like kitchen billows. The wolf pounced. Aranya dropped to her knees, nearly losing her balance on her bound ankles, and shoved her talons straight upward. They sliced through flesh. Blood rushed down her hands, her arms. A startled yelp sounded from the wolf as its body stiffened. She shoved it off her, leapt to her feet, and grabbed the lantern from the wall. With a sudden burst of adrenaline and terror, she smashed it over the wolf. Glass broke, metal bent. Fur caught fire. But the wolf was already dead. In the light of the licking fire, Aranya lifted her eyes to see Yong standing outside her cell, tall and stiff like a statue. She hobbled as far away from the wolf's body as she could, caught hold of the bars with her shaking, bleeding hands, and sunk to her knees. Yet she met that stony evanescer gaze with her own, between strands of hair fallen out of her braid. Apparently being only a partial shapeshifter isn't that bad, she said. She wasn't surprised when Yong evanesced through the bars, landing in a crouch before her gasping self, a knife in his hand catching the light of the dying tongues of fire on the wolf's body. If I could crawl into your mind and take whatever information I wanted, I would. But if you kill my men, then I will simply resort to old-fashioned torture. You've heard of slow slicing, haven't you? The blood drained from her face. Even her fast inhale slowed, almost completely stopped. Yong's eyes glittered as the tip of his knife danced along the skin of her arm. Death by 1,000 cuts, made one by one, slowly, with plenty of time to reconsider your decision to protect Kai. My earlier offer stands, to give you whatever you want in exchange for the name of the city. She was weak, exhausted, and frustrated. That frustration burned hot, overcoming all else. You think I'm trying to protect Kai? She snapped. If this was just about Kai, I'd have told you long ago. Young paused, his knife stilled against her elbow. What? You're asking me to betray my empire, my people, my family, myself. No, he said quickly. You're confused. How would this betray Junninghai? Because you're allied with a man rumored to be raising troops against the Empire. You're helping him, which means that helping you is betraying everything I love. I don't know what kind of man you are, Shi-Yong, that you would think I'd do that. Her gaze darted to his knife. Under any circumstance. Yong blinked, lips parting, clearly taken aback. With a growl, he put away his knife and stood. No wonder my brother has feelings for you. You're just like him, all noble. Kai doesn't have feelings for me, Aranya blurted with a frown. His eyes met hers for one long, hard moment. If you think that, then you're even more of a fool than I thought. In a flash, he evanesced beyond her cell. Better get comfortable. It looks like you'll be here for a while. And don't expect Kai to save you. Since there is only one key to this cell, I have it. And Kai can't evanesce you out of there. If he even comes back for you. The question was on the tip of her tongue, begging to be asked, wound up in anxiety. Is Delon all right? But to ask would be to betray herself. She kept her mouth shut as Yong strode out of the dungeon, his fancy boots clinking on stone as he left her alone with the stench of burned flesh.
Kai appeared in his mother's study, just knowing she was going to be there. With all her scrolls and her giant map of the Empire on one wall, cooking up a wicked scheme to use Aranya against him in a way that would guarantee his permanent cooperation with her. She was there, just like he'd known she would be, sitting on her colored mat, her chin lifted haughtily, her crimson lips set in an elegant pout. But though she'd taken her from the bathing chamber, Aranya was nowhere to be seen. His chest heaved, his hands balling into fists at his side. Where is she? So Young was right, said his mother airily, glancing idly at her floating lantern lights. You do care about the shapeshifter. In a way you never cared for those academy girls. It seems that you have a heart after all. A pity. There was a reason I raised you to be heartless. Caring makes you vulnerable, son. If you care about her, she's all we need to bring you home. Fire burned in Kai's lungs. Of all the things his mother had done to him, and all the things she hadn't been for him, he thought he might hate her the most for this. No matter what threat you make, said Kai, grinding out the words through his clenched jaw, I won't be your heir. I don't care about father's will. Make Young the heir. He's your favorite anyway. And he always had been. You know we cannot do that, said Lady Shi. Find a loophole, snapped Kai. That's what you're good at. Your father made sure of it. He knew I'd try. Not even your death will transfer the inheritance to Young. We need you, son. And we will have you. She'd actually looked into the possibility of killing him, her own son. He met her gaze. How had he ever called her mother? Then he evanesced out of the room. She wasn't helping. She didn't have Aranya, and he needed to find her before they hurt her. Now that he'd shown himself, everyone would be warned to expect him, to watch for him. Kai ducked into the shadows behind a stairwell, catching his breath and clutching his head, as though that would make everything better. Where would she be? Would they have put her in the dungeon already? Or was Young working on her somewhere else? His mind spun through all the things that could have happened to her while he was gone. His blood pounded frantically. Where? 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 This panic was nearly paralyzing. He'd start with the dungeons. Then he'd go from there. It took several leaps, and a unit of guards spotted him on his second one. Cursing, he kept going, hating all these barriers between him and Aranya. Then he landed in darkness. A horrid stench filled his nostrils, one of burned flesh. There, ahead, was the light of a fire. His heart stopped. Then he'd evanesced straight to the cell with the fire, and landed hard on his feet, nearly stumbling into a burning corpse. Oh, fathers, a corpse. It was a wolf. This only fractionally relieved his panic. He spun around, and there she was. She crouched in the corner, her bound hands gripping the iron bars, blood streaking down her bruised and dirty face, down her hands and dripping off her elbow. Her dark eyes were too wide in their sockets as she stared up at him, her mouth falling open. Kai nearly choked on his relief. Fathers, she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen.
Aranya first thought the tall shadow that appeared in her cell was Young and braced herself for another fight. She'd been given just enough time for her adrenaline to die down, for all her injuries to start aching and stinging, enough time to remember how much her feet and hands hurt despite being numb. Just enough time to wonder if she was trapped here forever. But someone evanesced into her cell, and every exhausted muscle in her body tensed, ready for fight, ready to... Then he turned around. Even with the dying fire behind him, even though only his silhouette was visible, she recognized him. Kai. Her heart skipped a beat while her lungs dropped all the way to her stomach in relief. Her mouth fell open, and it was his name on the tip of her tongue, and she just wanted to say it over and over again. And maybe cry, too. She sucked in a sharp breath, only to blink and find that dark looming form just in front of her, crouched in the shadows, and two warm fingers pressed against her lips, silently bidding her quiet. A tear pricked the corner of her eye. Kai glanced away from her, back toward the rest of the dungeon, as though watching for guards or evanescing family members. Then he turned back to her, grabbed her shoulders. "Are you all right?" Panic edged his hushed voice. His hand slipped up to cup her face, making her draw in a sharp breath. "They did hurt you. You're bleeding. Aranya." "Kai doesn't have feelings for me." "You're a fool if you believe that." Aranya blinked, startled. Kai was withdrawing a knife. He took her forearm, bringing up his knife. She jerked back and shook her head. His grip tightened as he tilted his head to one side. She grabbed him by the collar, dragging his face to hers so she could whisper in his ear, "They're spelled. Can't be cut." He twisted his face to look at her, very close. The whites of his eyes, ringing black pupils, were barely visible in the darkness. He sheathed his knife and, with another glance over his shoulder, gripped her upper arms and pulled her to her feet. She clung to the front of his tunic with both hands, trying to keep her balance. His grip was tight on her, almost painful with intensity. But it was a pain she didn't mind. She lifted her eyes, met his. "You can't get me out of here. Young said there's only one key, and he has it. Can you sneak it off him? If he knows you're back, he'll come to here to make sure. I don't need a key to get you out of here. But you can't take other people when you have an S. We'd be caught if we tried to cut the bars. Hush, he whispered, reaching out and pressing his finger again to her lips. She frowned at him, biting her tongue. Carefully, he let go of her, leaving her holding onto the bars for support. Then he vanished, and her heart seized up at his sudden absence. She was alone again with the wolf carcass. Until scratching. It was so soft at first she almost didn't notice it. The sound blended in with the silence, growing only fractionally louder with each hollow thud of her heart. A soft but high-pitched whine struck her next, made her feet tingle, her breathing grow stronger. She tightened her grip on the bars she held and turned to look over her shoulder at the back of the cell. She was just in time to watch the stone wall shift, and then there was Kai, a dark silhouette again, standing in the doorway of a secret passageway? Her heart lifted. Dare she hope? Dare she? A door farther down the dungeon banged open. He's here! He'll come straight for her! Suddenly, Kai was right in front of her just as torchlight came around the corner. His eyes were wide, bits of hair falling in his face as shadows cut his profile in sharp relief. Swiftly, he bent, gripped the back of her knees, and hoisted her up over his shoulder with a grunt. The world spun. She let out a small gasp, grasping fistfuls of his cloak for support, and then they were moving fast, ducking through the opening. Hey, hey! Came shouts behind them. She looked up to see Yong's face, stark with horror, staring at them as though in shock. He saw us, Aranya said. Kai half glanced over his shoulder, then broke into a run, kicking the tunnel door shut behind him. It bounced partially open again, but only a sliver of light was visible through it. It didn't matter. Doors couldn't keep evanescers out. Cool air swept down her spine, drier than the dungeon. Deeper darkness permeated the air, but Kai didn't slow one bit. Don't make a sound, said Kai, and ducked sharply to the left. She might as well have her eyes closed with how dark it was. Behind her ran clattering footsteps, alarmingly close. They abruptly stopped. Yong's voice, again unnervingly nearby, rang out back toward the door. Get a light in here! Kai ran faster, utterly silent, taking turns so sharply she dared not lift her head for fear of it getting slammed into the wall. Split up! Find them! Called Young to his guards. Turn this place upside down! Kai was breathing hard, but his grip on her never faltered. It almost seemed like the squeeze on her knee was his silent reassurance that he would get her out of this. It was the worst feeling, being unable to do anything except try not to move or make a sound. She gripped his cloak in both hands and hung on as tightly as she could. The further Kai ran, the thicker the darkness. Young's pursuit grew quieter, and for the first time she started to truly hope. Hope that they could get out of here, that they could escape, that she could be free. Then Young's voice cut through the caverns, far away but carried through the tunnels so it rung in their ears. Don't think this is over, Kai! We will track you down! I swear it on our father's grave! Kai gave a soft huff in response, and then he slowed to a stop. He kept one hand tight around her knees, while the other moved something that made a sharp whine in response. She cringed. And then, light. Thank the fathers. I was just about to come after you, came Talons' rough voice. Aranya shoved herself up, head twisting so she could find Talon, who was whole in hail with all appendages intact. You're all right, she gasped. Of course I'm all right. She sagged, still on Kai's shoulder, and her breath shuddered out of her. They followed us, blurted Kai, each breath a gasping pant. We only have a few minutes before they find this exit. Talon growled something inarticulate, and then Aranya found herself wrestled atop Kai's horse. Just as soon as she was sitting sideways, wrists and ankles still bound, Kai mounted up behind her, slipped an arm around her waist, and drew her back against his chest. She only had a fraction of a second to be stiff and embarrassed before they were galloping off at breakneck speed. And then they were moving so fast, none of it mattered. So she turned her face into the crook of his shoulder and neck and tried to breathe, to calm her racing heart. She felt when he tilted his head down to look at her, and then lifted it to keep focused on their flight. 39. No one spoke a word. Not until they were a safe distance from Gabe. The sun rose, turning the forest from green to golden, spilling across Aranya's exhausted eyes. She leaned heavily against Kai's chest, listening to the raging rhythm of his heart. It never slowed, even when they were hours from the city. It was the only distraction from staring down at her wretched bonds. Suddenly, Talon pulled a halt. Kai's heart leapt in response against her cheek, and she peered at the older wielder. Talon's face was so red, his jaw so tight, his fists so clenched, she thought he might explode. He did.
"What in the 7 layers of DU was that, boy?" Talon demanded. "You don't tell us to avoid Gabe, then you choose not to tell us why, let us walk into a dragon-blasted trap."
"I told you not to go to Gabe," snapped Kai in return.
"I said to go anywhere else after I'd already committed to. Even then, we could have stopped. But you didn't give any real reason to not go, now did you?"
"I couldn't give you a reason."
"My elbow, you couldn't. How about if you step foot in Gabe, you'll end up fighting for your life? That might have been nice to know."
"And what would you have done if I'd said that?" Kai demanded, his grip tightening on Aranya's shoulder.
"You would have asked to know what was going on? Yes, we would have. Just like I'm asking now. So tell me once and for all, Shikai, why was Princess Mei Ling bound and locked up in your family's dungeon? Is that what you can't tell us? That you are all traitors to the crown?"
Talon had seen that? She'd lost track of him when she'd been taken by Lady Shi, but apparently he'd also seen the princess being dragged away. Kai stiffened so sharply that she glanced up at his face. She expected to see the same look of rage that was written across Talon's face on Kai's, but instead he'd gone pale. Deathly pale, his lips suddenly bloodless in the dawn.
"Who was in the dungeon?"
he asked, voice wavering. His grip on her slackened. "Princess Mei Ling," said Aranya. "I heard your brothers say they were taking her to Feng." Kai swayed on his saddle. His hand trembled on the reins, enough to make Aranya's brow furrow.
I didn't know anything about this," he said.
She wanted to believe him. Talon, however, looked much more skeptical.
"Give me one reason why I shouldn't contact Secret Services and turn over your whole family."
"There's no proof," said Kai.
"She's proof,"
spat Talon, gesturing at Aranya.
"She heard what they said."
"Don't," said Kai immediately, almost breathlessly. His chest heaved against her.
"Please don't mention anything that Aranya heard." "Why not?"
His deep breath shuddered out of him.
"Because then she will be killed."
Aranya stiffened. Talon growled,
"By whom?"
"By Young."
"But then that would only prove yes, and Aranya would be dead. They don't have her. We have her."
"That won't stop him. There's no catching my family in their crimes. They're Evanescers. You can't catch them, can't bind them. I don't understand how they're connected with Feng. Truly, I don't. And while I haven't gone about this in the best way, I hope you both can see how hard I've tried to avoid them. I took my appointment in Sushui as a warden for the one and only purpose of staying below their radar. If that doesn't show where my loyalties lie, then I don't know what will." Even Talon was quiet at that. But Aranya's pulse had kicked up several notches, dread coiling heavily in her stomach.
"Kai," she said softly. "Yes?"
They wanted me to tell them where you'd gone. Kai's head snapped down to hers, his hands suddenly on her shoulders, twisting her so he could look at her. Did you tell them? His voice was a mix of desperate hope and terror. She lifted her eyes to meet his rounded ones. No, I didn't. The tension in him was gone in a split second, leaving him almost sagging against her. His sigh of relief could have blown a ship ashore. Then he muttered something under his breath that sounded an awful lot like, I could kiss you. What? His eyes snapped up to meet hers, and then he was shaking his head. You didn't tell them anything? Is that why they did this to you? He reached up, carefully touching her forehead near her temple. Dried blood cracked as she winced away from his touch. His gaze hardened, his mouth thinning as his jaw flexed. His grip on her shoulder dropped, and his arm looped back around her waist, holding her against him. Did she imagine he held her closer than before? She blinked against the rising swell of uncertainty and tried to block out the warmth of his arms around her as they rode. It was better to focus on the sun rising higher and higher into the sky, marking the start of a new day. Exhausted as she was, it was time to set their sights forward to the rest of the mission ahead of them. I saw a map of Lady Shi's, said Aranya. It had a path marked from cities all over the Empire, converging at Gabay, then heading north to a city or something marked Kai. Delon cast her a sideways glance.
Kai is the name of the enemy fortress on the border of Butagan and Juninghai.
I guess we're heading north then, said Aranya.
But first, said Delon, we need to free you from those phoenix-scorched bonds.
40. It was dusk before they reached their destination, a city called Hai that Delon knew had a cursebreaker. They rode into the city, found a patrolling warden, received directions to the cursebreaker's office, and proceeded thus. When they dismounted, it was another community effort of wrestling and awkwardness to get Aranya to the ground in front of the wooden deck outside the cursebreaker's hut. It looked like the other huts on the street, bare and dusty with a thatch roof. Delon held her steady on her feet, his grip driving into her biceps whenever she wobbled. By this time, blood from chafing stained her sleeves, and she was torn between desperation and apathy. She'd been like this all day, might as well wait a few more minutes. At the same time, she was nearly gasping with anticipation of relief. Kai strode up to the door and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, much louder. Still no answer. He fisted his hand and pounded into the wood.
Go away! We're closed for the day!
Came the shriek from inside.
Open up! We need your help!
Called Kai.
I says we's closed for the day!
Delon ground his teeth, dragged Aranya to the deck so she could catch hold of a splintering pillar. Then he marched up the steps, banged on the door, and shouted wrathfully,
Open this door, witch! We've got a girl here in a nasty predicament with spelled bonds we can't cut. Oh,
pound,
pen,
slam,
up!
Aranya bit her lip, fighting the sudden despair coating her throat. Kai glanced back from the door to her. Briefly, they held each other's gaze. He looked back toward the door where the cursebreaker inside berated them.
The sign says closed!
She shrieked.
Comes back tomorrow's.
She's in pain.
I don't serves peoples who calls me witch.
Delon looked skyward, his jaw working.
I'm sorry I called you a witch. Will you just look at her?
I's making no promises. We's closed.
But the door clicked, a bolt being drawn back. Then another, and another. 7 bolts in all. After the last bolt, silence. The door flung wide open. Delon barely leaped back to avoid getting his face smashed by the door as a hook-nosed crone peered out from the building. Eyes narrow and sagging skin pinched and leathery. She peered from around the door, clutching it with knobby fingers.
How's this?
She growled.
You brought me what?
Aranya pushed herself upright and, balancing carefully, held up her hands. We cannot cut them. The crone's eyes narrowed, and the door creaked as she pushed it open further. She scuttled out a few steps, her knot-like elbows on display around the edges of her patchwork cloak.
What's this?
She croaked. Aranya licked her lips and held the bonds out to her, trying not to let her face brighten too much with hope that might only be dashed a second later. If we try to cut it, it tightens. The woman gripped Aranya's thumb and raised it up, turning her hands this way and that to view the bonds.
Hmm.
A few seconds later, after a painful poke at her wrists, too near where she'd been bitten by the wolf, that made her hiss, the woman said again,
Hmm.
You can break this spell? Talon prodded. We can pay, of course.
The crone scoffed, dropping Aranya's hands.
I don't work for free, boy.
Talon glared at her. She scooted up the steps, making odd smacking sounds with her mouth.
But no, I can't help her. This isn't a true curse. I don't works in those kinds of spells. You'll need to find the spellcaster and get him to undo it.
Wait, but...
Talon started, leaping toward the door. The crone was shockingly fast. Too quick for Talon, she slammed the door behind her, and in quick succession, threw each bolt back in place with punctuated emphasis. All three of them stared at the locked door before them. Then Kai and Talon both turned to Aranya. She stared back at them, trying not to sag hopelessly beneath their gazes.
Stay with her,
Talon growled, turning on Kai.
There's got to be another way. I'll be back soon.
With that, he mounted his horse and rode away into the sunset falling over the city. Kai shifted his gaze to her, all mirth mercifully gone from his face. Except that what replaced it only made her bristle more. Pity. She swallowed and shrugged. I'm sure Talon will find something. He heaved a sigh that was the opposite of agreement. He descended the stairs, not looking at her, and muttered, Want to wait here or somewhere else? She forced a smile and said, Here's fine.
Would you like to sit?
I've been sitting all day.
Very well. Hungry?
She nodded. He started for their horses. But the moment the twist returned to his lips, before he could say anything, she snapped. If you say anything about me being heavy or eating too much beef jerky after you had to carry me so much last night, I'm going... He turned, holding up his hands innocently as he continued walking backward toward the horse. He couldn't suppress his grin, and the sight of it eased something tight inside her chest.
I wasn't going to say anything.
She huffed, but had to turn away to keep from revealing her own smile. Perhaps a little fun was what they needed now, when everything was looking so dire for her and their mission. They could pretend none of the problems with the Shi family had ever happened, and just return to being antagonistic comrades. She armed herself with a sly grin when he returned with a rice cake. It quickly faltered when she saw the meager offering. What? This is it? He opened his mouth to respond, his eyes glittering wickedly, when they suddenly darted over her shoulder down the street. All amusement fled his face. He slipped the rice cake into his pocket. She tried to follow his line of sight, but she startled when he grabbed her shoulders, bringing his face suddenly close to hers. She was about to snap something about personal space, but his jaw clenched so tightly she could hear his teeth grinding. What's wrong? She asked in a strained whisper. Please don't tell me your brother is behind me. His gaze flicked from beyond her down to her face.
Oh no, definitely not.
But he didn't relax. She twisted to look behind her, but he tightened his grip on her shoulders, keeping her fixed in place. His words came tumbling out.
Remember that fine your grandfather accrued that you couldn't pay in Sushui?
Yes? Wait, how did you know about that? I didn't tell. I paid it. Now, you what? I'm calling in my debt. Just forgive me in advance, all right? Kai, what in the seven? Her question was cut off. The hands gripping her shoulders tightened and drew her close. Far too close. It all happened so fast she couldn't even squeak as her eyes flew wide, and Kai kissed her. It was lightning to her gut. Her bound fists flew up to grip the front of his shirt and shove him away, but his hands moved to cup her face in a strangely tender gesture, and then he really kissed her. It swept through her like fire, then water that made her limbs go liquid. She stumbled, losing her balance on her bound feet. One of his arms wrapped around her, catching her against him. She forgot her painful bonds, her swollen and bruised face. She had never been kissed like this. Was that why her heart suddenly ached so sharply in her chest? Why tears sprang behind her shut eyelids and a painful lump formed in her throat? He pulled back, and belatedly her eyelashes fluttered open to find him searching her face. Could he read this sudden and unexpected burst of emotion inside her? There was something flashing in that hazel gaze. Something vulnerable. Something almost pained. His brows came together in a pinch, and then he leaned in again. His nose brushed hers softly. Almost a nuzzle. Definitely a question. She couldn't help herself. She closed her eyes and tilted her chin up with a tiny whimper on her lips. Her answer. Her hands were still fisted in his tunic, but she couldn't push him away. Not in this reckless, bewildering moment. Not in this moment, when it was like being simultaneously torn to pieces and knit back together as a tear slipped free and his lips found hers again. His second kiss was not at all what she expected. It was the sort of soft, lingering kiss a couple would share after being married for 20 or 30 years. The kind that spoke of promises, of endless days ahead, and half-finished stories behind. It was a kiss that called to the deep craving of her soul, to hold and be held without the fear of imminent loss. It held a magic that could make her lose her head, turn her into a lovesick fool with no will or mind of her own. How many girls had he kissed to be this good? Her senses came roaring back. She found the strength in her arms to push him back, to break the kiss, even as he tightened his arm around her to keep her from falling. "What was that?" she sputtered, dashing angrily at her wet cheek with her bound hands. His answering grin was triumph itself. Except, it wasn't at all. That grin wasn't the least bit true. It was like the cool expression he'd worn in the bathing chamber when Yang had his knife to her throat. Distant, detached, like he didn't care at all. After the tenderness of his kiss, she could tell the difference. Could read his twitching eyebrow, the way his eyes seemed to darken as he withdrew from the vulnerability of affection. What was she supposed to think or feel now? Should she be angry because he'd kissed her without her permission? Should she be embarrassed because she'd enjoyed it and had asked for the second? It was too much. She felt it all. Rage at herself for her own vulnerability in front of her rival. Confusion about why she had the sudden and overwhelming urge to crawl into a ball with her fluffy white cat back in Souchway and cry. Over how long it had been since she'd been with her grandfather. Over what she'd faced in Gabay. Over knowing it was only a matter of time before she had no one else in this world. She hated herself for the inexplicable longing for Kai to be something more. It was ridiculous, really. This just went to show how much unexpected kisses could ruin everything, and why he should not have kissed her in the first place. She squared her shoulders, scowling, ready to spout off a rebuking tirade. Her bonds fell off. Aranya startled, her chafed and bleeding wrists suddenly free. The vines trussing her ankles broke away too, leaving her jaw gaping like a codfish. She pried her hands free of Kai's shirt and held them up before her. They looked horrible and felt even worse, but she couldn't feel pain in the flood of relief. "The kiss broke the spell on the vines," she breathed, trying to rub the feeling back into her hands. The Yanjiao technique. It was something they'd been taught at the academy, but it hadn't even occurred to her that something like the Yanjiao technique, a kiss to break the spell, would work in a situation like this.
Fathers,
Kai gasped, clearly as shocked as she was. Her head shot up and she snapped, "Why did you kiss me, Shikai? What is wrong with you? I'm not one of your dalliances. 7 Valleys, I'm your colleague." But his attention flitted back over her head. Now, limbs finally unhindered, she turned to see what he looked at. Oh. A young woman, clearly a warden on patrol, stared from the opposite side of the street, her mouth open and eyes ringed in hurt. Her gaze darted between Kai and Aranya.
"Come on,"
he said, a bit gruffly, and took her arm to steer her away. His face was determined as he snatched the leads of their horses. "Who was that? Do you know her?" Aranya said, stumbling after him on numb feet. Why did you—"
"She and I—"
He let out a frustrated exhale.
"We were involved, back at the academy. I guess she thought it was serious."
"Wait, you courted at the academy?"
"I didn't court. At least I didn't think it was."
"And you just used me to get back at her?" Aranya's cry was near outrage.
"She's been insistent. Years later. I've told her no 1,000 times, and she won't listen, and she knows my family, and look, you saw my family."
He broke off, cursing under his breath.
"I'm sorry, Aranya. I shouldn't. It was all I could think of. She's gone behind my back more than once to tell my mother."
He stopped, didn't start again. He scratched the back of his neck, watching her. Aranya stared at him, not knowing what she should be thinking or feeling. He turned wincing eyes to hers.
"At least you're free now."
"At least?" She ground her teeth, working her jaw, eyes fixed unseeing down the street, away from Kai. Anywhere but Kai. Her chest heaved with each breath, frustration mounting on every inhale. Then her gaze snapped to his. He stood still, long legs planted widely in the dirt. He'd folded his arms across his chest, losing the vulnerable posture and instead meeting the force of her gaze with his. As if to dare her to hate him for freeing her from those impossibly wretched bonds. There it was again, that closed-off expression. It was like they were back at the Tsushui ward post only moments after they'd been told they would be competing for the wardenship, sizing each other up and refusing to back down. She tilted her chin up. "This isn't over, Evanescence." He gave her a dark smirk.
"Who said it was?"
If you would like to download Kai's perspective of Aranya's nightmare, you can download it at anastasisblythe.com/Kai. And don't forget to read the next book, Warrior of Blade and Dusk, for the rest of Kai and Aranya's story.